Hey, good evening. Hope everybody's doing well. Wanted to go back and cover chapter 8. So I apologize, I had to jump ahead to chapter 9 and now I want to come back. I felt like what I provided previously on handouts was a little bit short. So this is a little bit more detailed. Want to give you a more detailed review of contractual risk. I think it's a really important aspect of the overall risk management process. When you don't have insurance in place, or even if you do have insurance, having contractual risk opportunities definitely mitigates some of the risks that you don't want to take on or that you're unable to control directly because you have someone else working on your project. So I'm going to go forward and share my screen with you all. Just give me a moment and I will get that brought up. Okay, here we go. As we've talked about in the very beginning of the chapter, the very first chapter of this book, we talked about there are two primary categories of risk management. The first being risk control. That is when we try to reduce the probability or the impact of a risk to the business. The other side or major category of risk management would be risk financing. That's our way of paying for risk or funding the risk if it does occur. So under risk financing, the part where we pay for risk, there's two options. We can either retain it ourselves, pay for it out of our own pocket, or we transfer to third party. We're most likely familiar with the part where we transfer it to an insurer. An insurance company is the typical holder of most risks. But there's also a way you could transfer some of that risk financing or the risk funding to another third party, whether it be a contractor or someone we're doing business with. So we're going to cover a lot more of that. This is the primary function, is it's non-insurance risk transfer, which means that it's embedded in our risk contracts. So I just talked about, there's really, just to compare the two, insurance risk transfer versus non-insurance risk transfer. The first one being that the financial consequence of any accidental loss is actually transferred to that third party, the insurer, who's actually taking a variety of different parties and pulling those risks together. There's also working on transferring different hazard risks. Contractual is the same way. It is involving the transfer of hazard risks, but the agreement is between parties that are involved in a contract and how they determine how risks will be handled if they occur. It does not pool risks together of more than one transfer being the individual whose business is being utilizing a third party to help them. So it's not stretching it out over multiple parties. It's actually just taking the risk of one party and transferring them to someone they're doing business with. And either side, a non-insurance risk transfer can either be transferring some of the risk control activities, meaning they're more directly involved with the process or the activity that they're doing, so they can help mitigate the risk, or on the other side of it, they can actually help in the cost recovery part of following the loss. Overall definition of a contractual risk transfer involves, it's an agreement between one party, which we will call the transferee. This would be the person who's acting not as an insurer, but they're taking the risk of the transferor, which would be their party, their risk. So let's say I'm the business, I would be considered the transferor. I have different loss exposures associated with my business, and I'm transferring them to another third party who's helping me do my job, doing my business. They are considered the transferee. And it's related to the incidental aspect of another business transaction. So it can fall in one of two categories that I already mentioned. It can be non-insurance risk control or non-insurance risk financing. The contract typically is formed before any loss occurs. So this isn't something you decide after the fact. You should be putting up front in the thought process and the evaluation of a contract of what could go wrong. And if something does go wrong, how are we going to handle those particular risks? The one thing I will note that providing that risk financing side, until it's actually paid for by that transferee, it's really not protecting you. So if they fail to pay, if they are bankrupt, if they default in any way on that risk, the financial burden still is not transferred, it still belongs with you. So there's some other aspects to this we'll talk about later in the chapter. So just saying that they're going to take care of it doesn't ensure that you're going to get paid. You need to have a way to fund it, making sure that their promise is kept good by having some other mechanism to pay for it. So having insurance is the most likely option, but you definitely want to think about that. Their word is only as good as their ability to pay for it. So in the risk control transfer, there's several different examples we're going to go through, but if a bankrupt or uncooperative transferee, the one who's willing to take on risk, this contractor you're working with, if they may continue to be responsible even if they're bankrupt, if you do the risk control side of it. And it would preserve your transaction. Doesn't mean they're going to pay for it, but it definitely holds them responsible for what they were willing to take on. So let me go into the examples rather than dwelling too much on this particular slide. There's at least, it says 7 different options here that we're going to cover in this book or in this chapter. Most of these you've probably heard about or learned about in different capacities throughout your education so far. Many times risk managers do not even handle risk control transfer contracts. Risk managers don't typically get involved in the decision to enter a lease or to contract for services or to set up a waiver of responsibility. They also don't decide what kind of financial or business structure that you set up, or if you're going to incorporate a business. So these are things that are usually beyond the day-to-day responsibilities of a risk manager, but they're good to know because if you have any opportunity to insert your opinion on this, it would be really important to know a little bit more about them. First one being incorporation. Not a surprise, it's a way to manage or control risks, and setting up that separate legal entity that saves or protects your own personal investment in financial information and assets is really important. So if you're going to invest in a company, you want to make sure that if something goes wrong and the business fails or some significant issue or accident occurs, they won't be able to go and place a lien against your own personal assets. So having that legal entity distinction from its shareholders, who the corporation remains solely responsible for its own wrongdoings. Corporation serves as that transferee for risk for the individual stockholder. So in this case, it's not a third party, it's having that third or that separate organizational structure that keeps you protected, is you're actually transferring that risk to the corporation. That way you can lose no more than the value of what you've invested in the business. So yeah, you have stock invested there, and if something major happens, you have a major lawsuit that wipes out the assets of the corporation, what you have at risk or at stake would be your investment in the company, but it won't take into account every other investment that you have in your own personal assets. So it's going to most likely typically reduce your financial loss to the value of your assets. It definitely insulates your personal assets. And what we'll kind of mention is that segregation is the term that we use when an organization can insulate its losses between different activities and functions. So a lot of times we think of subsidiaries. That's actually a segregation of an organization's different risks or activities. So maybe one portion of their business has a higher risk than the other. As a utility, we have electric, gas, natural water, transportation, and telecommunications. Now, we are one organization. We are a public entity, meaning we are governmental. So we don't have those different segregations. But if I was a for-profit business running a utility, I might isolate those portions of the business that we run in different segments. That way, if I have a major gas incident, it wouldn't wipe out the assets of another business of mine. Although it would have a large impact on the overall portfolio of the company, it's not going to take down the entire organizational structure. Occasionally, though, I will put a word of warning. Courts have pierced through the corporate veil and have actually pursued those major stockholders that have personal assets if they're in a highly involved managing role. So it's not a perfect protection, you can't guarantee, but especially if there's any kind of negligence involved with a managing partner and they had some poor business decisions with the intent of doing something to harm another. So it's not perfect. Leasing, we all know what leases are. So a leasehold is typically the right to occupy or use the property of somebody else for a period of time. You choose to rent a building, lease an office space or a manufacturing plant. You're allowed to use that property for that period of time. The lessor is the property owner. You, as the person taking out the lease to use their property, would be called the lessee. So the lessor, the one who owns the property, retains that risk associated with their property. Meaning if it burns to the ground, it's their property, they've insured that property, and they're the ones who are going to be harmed by the loss of that. Even though you may have some kind of, in your agreement, you may have some kind of arrangement where you help fund that, in reality, they're the ones who are going to take the biggest hit. So the lessee or tenant, as we will call that, would be leasing rather than owning the property. So they're exercising risk control. If they chose to buy the property, they would have to implement their own insurance and making sure that, fire suppression's in there and that there are certain, if there's flammables in the building, they don't have to worry about as many concerns as if they just said, hey, you know what, I'm just going to lease it. I don't have to worry about what happens in the building. You can't be careless, but you definitely have less risky exposure during a lease than you would have if you owned it. There are a few exceptions. Leases obligate the lessee to return it in the same condition as it was received. So if you've made a promise that it's going to be left in the same condition, that's probably going to put you on the hook for a little bit more than what you would normally. And also, if your actions or activities were put it in a dangerous condition that harmed others, you're probably going to have more responsibility. So if your lease agreement has that in there, your negligence to an extreme measure would probably be counted as a responsible party. There's another arrangement called sale and leaseback, where the property owner actually transfers the risk to a third party. Maybe it's a property management company. And the one good thing about that is they actually get cash. They can cash out their equity for a period of time to this third party management team to manage it. So it's their way of getting out, and then they might actually get it back at the end, depending on how the arrangement is set up. Another one that we don't necessarily talk about a whole lot, but you need to think about is when we contract for services, instead of doing that with our own personnel, we're essentially subcontracting that work out. So if you, as an organization or as an individual, performing a particular activity, maybe it's I am selling a product or building a building, you usually are the primarily responsible party if anything goes wrong with that activity. However, you can contract with another organization to perform that activity. Instead of using your own employees, you could hire a third party who would actually manage the work on a day-to-day level. If something goes wrong in the work that they're doing, then that third party subcontractor would actually have some responsibility. Any contract requiring another party to perform or accept risks associated with an activity is called subcontracting. You have the opportunity to recap any property, net income, or personnel loss exposures associated with that activity that you're transferring. So your subcontractor would be on the hook for helping pay back any of those things that are caused by their negligence. And the agreement must meet any legal contract requirements that would be required for any fairly negotiated transfer. Both loss exposure and the burden of financing it would rest with the contractor, as long as you didn't have undue pressure and put extra risk on them, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. Sometimes it's not acceptable to transfer all this risk to a third party if you have a higher bargaining power than the other individual or party involved. So as long as it's fair and it's been negotiated fairly, then I think those liabilities would rest with the subcontractor. There are some limitations I want to mention. So some types of exposures are not easily transferred, that especially those that relate to harm done to third parties. So if you have a responsibility, let's say you own a piece of property and you're doing construction on it, and someone's doing something and it causes like maybe a slip and fall hazard, or they're tearing out the concrete and someone could actually fall off into it and hurt themselves, that liability can never completely be transferred to a third party, primarily because you own the property. Whoever sets foot on your property would expect that you provide some level of care. So some things you cannot transfer completely to a third party. So even if the subcontractor's employees create the hazard that injures somebody, the injured party is still going to sue you. They consider you the primary landowner, or you would be considered the general potentially, and you're never going to be able to walk away from the responsibilities associated with that property. Courts generally hold the hiring contractor or owner responsible in several circumstances. If the negligence, you were negligent in selecting a good contractor. Let's say you hired someone who did a poor job, doesn't have good safety requirements. Maybe you didn't give them clear direction. You failed to stop some work that you knew was highly dangerous and they weren't following safety procedures and you were aware of them. That would not be able to be transferred to that third party. By law, certain duties and responsibilities will never be able to be delegated to another party. We call those typically, those are their inherently danger. If I don't know if you guys remember, we talked about vicarious liability. So sometimes certain types of work cannot ever be legally transferred to another individual or party because the work associated with it is such a high risk. So those type of things you need to be careful of. So things like blasting, excavating near public highway, they are what I would call inherently dangerous. That's called vicarious liability that you cannot transfer to that other party. Suretyship. So I'm not sure if you've had this in any other class. I think I've covered it in 313 a little bit, but I wanted to review it for those of you that didn't have 313 yet, or if you've forgotten. So as someone that promises to do work for you, you may be concerned that they may not follow through, they may become bankrupt, they may not finish the work, they may walk away from it and never complete it. So there's different things you can do. You can request that third party who's doing work for you to set up an agreement and actually have kind of insurance, as I would call it, a backing by a surety. A surety is a party, and it can be an insurance company that guarantees that and I have the word in there, oblige, but it's really obligee. I'm missing an E there, sorry. And that they will perform, that they're going to ensure the obligee that the principal will fulfill their obligation to do the work that they promised. If that company or business fails to perform, then they're going to make sure that either they're going to do the work or they're going to get someone to do the work that they failed to follow through on. That's the surety's job, an insurance company. The obligee is the party who's actually contracting the work. So you're hiring someone to do work, you're receiving that surety's guarantee that the principal will either perform it as promised or they're going to hire it to be done. And the last party would be the principal or obligor, obligor is the party whose performance or obligation to guarantee is guaranteed by the surety. So you're the contractor, you're the principal obligor that is responsible for completing work. You're hired to perform a set of work. And this surety agreement protects the obligee, I'm missing an E again, by providing a second source of performance. So here's a visual representation of how that works. Really, the original agreement was between this principal, this is the contractor doing work for you, let's say, that has some work that needs to be done. You're the obligee, they promise to perform work. And in order to make sure that they get it done, you're asking them to put a surety agreement in place. So they're actually paying a bond premium to the surety. In return, the surety for that premium is going to give them a surety agreement, which essentially guarantees the performance. So the guarantee is between the surety and the obligee, that if the principal doesn't do it, the work that was promised, they're going to make sure it's taken care of. But the original work agreement is between the principal and obligee. They're paying the surety to take care and provide that assurance, and the surety has an obligation to us to make sure that it's performed. Something slightly different, but similar tone would be similar to the surety, that the obligee relies on another party. In this case, it's a guarantor for performance. And a guarantee agreement is a little bit different because the guarantor is the person or organization that promises to perform the duty. They're not going to necessarily hire someone to do it. They're going to perform it themselves. So a guarantor might be another contractor, someone who has that skill set that is needed to perform the work. So they're only obligated to perform after the obligee, I'm missing an E again, has made every reasonable and legal effort to comply or to compel the principal's performance. So you can't just run to the guarantor immediately. You would have to try and exhaust every other option that you have to get that principal to perform. And if they fail to do so, then you can go after the guarantor, who will make sure and do that work for you. Both of those agreements allow the obligee to segregate their loss exposures. Rights of the surety to protect against misconduct or collusion. So, the surety is getting paid, and obviously they want to, follow through on it, but they also want to be protected to make sure that the principal and the obligee aren't like colluding, or there's any misconduct on part of the setup of the surety. They want to be protected. So the suretyship law releases the surety from performance if the principal either rightly refuses to perform for contract for defects, or if there's fraud in securing the agreement. So maybe they misled the surety in what their skill sets were or their financial state. So if they lied to the surety, that would protect the surety from having to do something that it wasn't expecting to do because they failed to give you full information. And if there's any major contract defects, like I said, this shoddy work that they haven't followed through on. Some examples, one, first of all, the surety, if there's extreme fraud involved, they would have the ability to be removed from their duty and they'd be released of any liability if they've been lied to and the contract was put in place under false pretenses. It also, through subrogation, would entitles the surety to actually get the same payment that the principal would have received. So again, they could go after, if the hiring party lied about something, they could actually get whatever payment would have been received by the principal. And finally, the surety could actually proceed against the principal themselves to recover the fair value of its efforts or any funds that they had to pay the obligee for inaction. So essentially, they have a lot of rights to go after. If they've either been misled, they can be released for liability if not given all the information, and they also can have the rights to recover against the individuals who have actually caused the damage. Contractual commitment is the same as the principal, so any legal offense that would be in existence for non-performance would release the principal from the underlying contract would also be in place for the surety. So essentially they get the same rights as the principal if there's any reason to go back against the original contractor, obligee, the person who's doing the contracting. And essentially they can also be released if the original contract was modified without their consent. They need to be party of everything that goes on with the contract, since they are making promises to fulfill that contract. You guys have heard the term waiver. So this is essentially where you relinquish some right to go after or sue a third party, either for violation of contract or they've basically committed a tort. This allows the organization to rid itself of any liability. It can serve as an effective risk control measure. So exculpatory clause, it's also considered similar to as a waiver, both intended to eliminate one party's liability from another. Some states use these two terms interchangeably, waiver or exculpatory clause. Effective waivers result from fair negotiation. You don't want it to have undue pressure or power on one party that could conceal or deceive or put ambiguous language that wouldn't be fair to the other party. So in order to have a waiver that would withstand the court system, it has to be fairly negotiated. It's usually obtained in the original contract before the initiation or before the contract starts or before any harm is suffered. A waiver of subrogation, this would mean that pre-loss, you've made a voluntary relinquishment to seek reimbursement for damages against the third party. other than the insured. So basically you're saying as the insurer that I will not go after that party that caused the damage because you have already agreed ahead of the damage that you would waive the rights to sue that third party that you're doing business with. And that is acceptable in most cases. So make sure you know what waiver of subrogation means. It's definitely something that would probably be on your exam. Limitation of liability. This is a real common protectionary measure put in place. In most contracts, this is where the transferor, the person doing, who owns the property or owns the building, and the transferee, the contractor doing the work, they have equal bargaining power, and assuming that, then the transferor may agree to cap or limit the liability associated with the work. So they tell the contractor, you know what, I'm willing to limit your liability to X amount of dollars. It's used instead of waiving your liability in total. It's saying, I will hold you liable, but here's the maximum amount that you're going to be held liable for. I would use caution, though, associated with limitation of liability. A lot of companies think, or purchasers think, well, if the contract is worth $100,000 and they're coming out to do work in the value of $100,000, I would feel comfortable limiting their liability to $100,000. I have some major concerns with that as a risk manager. Just because it costs X number of dollars to do the work doesn't mean that they couldn't cause a lot more damage. I know if most contractors want to limit their liability to the value of the contract, seems reasonable, but it's definitely not a good practice because that potential for much larger costs involved with the work performed. And I'll give you an example, real high level. One of the largest power plant losses in history in our country, today's value would be several $100 million. That actual initial cause of loss was because a plumbing contractor did something inappropriate when they were cleaning out or snaking a line when they were out at the power plant, causing water to spew out. Good water went into the control rooms, destroyed a lot of electronics that controls the power sensors. Essentially, when they cleaned it all up, the switch was switched and turned on the natural gas. So when they went back to relight, they were bringing their combustion turbine back online. The chamber was filled with natural gas, which exploded and caused major damages in the neighborhood of several $100,000. So if you would have said, you know what, it's a small contractor and all they're doing is maybe $2,000 worth of work, so I'm going to limit their liability to $2,000. That's a little bit misleading because you don't know what their damage could cause. Disclaimer of warranty. So this is where, if you're selling, if you're a seller of a property, you can assert disclaimers of warranty. Maybe you're selling somebody a piece of property and you may actually give an express warranty, which means that you're basically saying, you're clearly outlining in the wording of your contract what you're warranting in conjunction with the sale. A lot of people don't like to put that in writing because you're not guaranteeing what fit for use it is. And it may also deny any implied warranty. So if someone says, I'm going to buy this piece of property with the sole intent of doing this type of business on site, you don't want to give any of those warranties confirming that your property is suitable for a particular purpose. So that's something you want to kind of put in your wording, that if I'm selling it to you, I don't want to give any warranties of what it's able to do because it can come back against you later. The other side, so some contracts, like I said, we talked about risk control. Now we're going to switch over to the non-insurance risk financing transfer. So this is where contracts are put in place to transfer any of the financial burden associated with loss, not to mitigate the loss itself, but to fund the financial losses. So protection is only as reliable as the transferee's ability and willingness to pay. So just because the contractor says, I'm willing to take full responsibility for any damage I may cause, does not mean that they're going to be able to pay for it. And so we'll talk about this again at the end, but one of the things that I can, as a risk manager, can do, I don't know, I can look at their financial statements and I can look at how financially stable they are, but I can't promise what the market's going to hold or what kind of damages they're going to incur and all their other work efforts. So what I can do is force them to have a certain amount of insurance that's going to protect them as well as my company, so that if they cause a loss, I can at least collect some money from their insurer to cover the potential damage that they've caused. So again, protection only is as good as their ability to pay. So a promise to pay doesn't guarantee you anything. And if a transferee fails to provide any kind of money to you, the burden still remains with you. It's useful having a risk financing transfer for a loss characteristic that places it beyond the scope of the typical insured contract. So, if you can't buy insurance for a particular function, then it's really good to have some kind of a financial risk transfer clause in place. So again, if it's some kind of a loss that you can't insure, it's really good to have something in your contract. The transferee, that person or contractor doing the work, we call those the transferee, they have more direct knowledge of the risk than a typical insurance underwriter would, such as maybe in a maintenance agreement, a service agreement. So it's better to transfer it to that contractor rather than trying to underwrite it with insurance. Because one, the insurer could charge you too much, or they don't understand what the risk is completely, so they don't adequately protect you. Another reason was if the transferee is motivated to provide some kind of indemnity to you, whereas the insurer might question the right to payment for the indemnity. So it's really good when a transferee is willing and motivated to make the sale occur or the contract to occur, and they're willing to give you that indemnity. You always want to take it. Despite the potential risk, the option can provide so you might find out that they don't have the ability to pay you, so it ultimately doesn't get transferred. But despite that risk, the option can provide some protection for you under certain conditions. And there's two common types of non-insurance risk financing transfers. These two you definitely need to know for the exam. The first one is a hold harmless agreement, and the other one is transferring of risk to the transferee's insurer. So I am actually going to not just transfer it to them, I'm also going to say that their insurer has some obligation to me of the risk that I'm transferring. Let's get a little bit more detail on the hold harmless agreement. So what is a hold harmless agreement? This is a contract under which one party is agreeing to assume the liability of a second party. And I'm agreeing to hold you harmless in the event I do something wrong or we jointly do something wrong potentially, but either way, I'm taking on responsibility for work or your responsibilities and liabilities working with you. So there are two parties to this contract. The first is the indemnitor. We also call that the transferee. This is the person or party taking on the risk in the agreement. So they're assuming the risk for any legal claims that are brought about because of their activities or their failure to do something correctly. The indemnity, or also what we would call a transferor, is that party whose legal liability is assumed. The best way to put this would be an indemnitor is the contractor. Indemnity or transferor would be the business that's hiring them to do the work. So the business is transferring their legal liability to this contractor, and the contractor is willing to assume that and any liabilities that result from their activity. It can provide funds for restoring accidental losses to property, net income, liability claims, or loss of service of key personnel. So having a hold harmless agreement definitely does protect you in many different ways. It's typically used when one party has the bargaining power to require the other party to assume the risk. So I hate to use this example, but as a larger utility, and because we have a high risk associated with a lot of our business lines, we have a lot of leverage, I would call it, or bargaining power in the transaction. And we typically will ask that our contractors assume a certain level of responsibility. If we're the small fish in this big situation or contract, let's say we're negotiating an agreement with Microsoft, we are nobody, we have no bargaining power. It's less likely that we're going to get them to be responsible for things where their software fails. So you really got to look at when one party has more bargaining power, they're more likely to get the other party to assume risk. It affects the effects of punitive damages and bankruptcy vary across jurisdictions. So some jurisdictions The punitive damage payments would go automatically within the hold harmless, which is pretty rare. Some make the transfer of obligation to pay punitive damages illegal in some states, and then depending on the jurisdiction that you live in, bankruptcy could excuse them for some of the requirements. Others it will not. So you have to be aware of what your state law is and how strongly the hold harmless would hold up in the event of bankruptcy or the assessment of punitive damages. So the other major one we talk about, hold harmless, is one of the risk financing tools that's used most often, and the other is transferring your risk to the transferees or contractors insurer. So there's two endorsements that you can ask your third party to put in place. We always ask for an additional insured endorsement for every one of our contractors where we can get it. Essentially what that does is it provides your rights as a business under the policy, provides you the rights under their policy. So if they cause damage, you have basically your name on the insurance policy. It also waives the rights of the transferee, the person, the contractor, their insurance. They cannot come after you as the third party transferor. So they have to pay you, and they can't, if you cause the damage, they can't come after you. It's an additional source of funds that's there to help pay for losses. You don't have to pay for them. Essentially, it's free coverage because the transferee or contractor is actually paying for the funds. They're the ones paying for the insurance payment. And the right to demand that you have the right to demand that their insurer pay costs to defend you as well. So it's a great coverage to have. You're asking your third party to get that endorsement, which might cost them money, but probably not a lot. And you're asking them for their insurance to cover you for the work that they're doing for you. The only disadvantage would be, there isn't a disadvantage for the transferee because they may, by adding you as an additional insured, it may make it more difficult for them to get coverage. And they still might potentially be liable for any exposures not covered in the policy. So even though they put you on as an additional insured, if it's if it's not covered in the insurance policy, they're still on the hook and they have no way to pay for it. The second one would be named insured endorsement, which actually gives more elevated privileges to the transferor or the business owner. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. The major advantages of being a named insured is it transfers, your agents, your employees and officers and directors would be considered as insured on the transferee's policy, which is additional coverage. You're a higher level party on the contract. The transferor or business would be entitled to receive the notice of any cancellation or endorsement. So if they decide to cancel the policy, you'd be one of the first ones to know. The disadvantage would be, though, that the insurer that's doing this may have the right to inspect your business and your records. They're going to have more say in what you do, and you may unknowingly agree to provide periodic reports to the insurer, so you actually have to do more work. Also, you may become involved in litigation that's unrelated to the relevant insurance coverage. So by being a named insured, it may drag you into more than what you anticipated. Most risk managers prefer that additional insured coverage endorsement in contrast to the named insured. But ensures that transferee provides this is what I always make sure everybody knows, make sure they show proof of endorsement. So even though they say they've put you on as an additional insured, you really want to see proof. You want to see the actual endorsement, and you want to see it on the certificate of insurance. We always validate that it's on there before we start any contract to make sure that we're protected as we thought we would be. I'm going to cut this particular video right here, and I'm going to start up with the next one. Let's kind of break it up. That way it's not too lengthy. We'll continue with chapter 8 and the next part of the video. Thank you. Talk to you soon.